What if I told you that beneath the crimson glow of every blood moon, an ancient ritual unfolds that makes every vampire movie you've ever seen look like a children's bedtime story? What if the most terrifying night in supernatural history isn't fiction at all, but a documented tradition of survival that has shaped the hidden war between humanity and the undead for over 1,000 years? Welcome to Blood and Scripture, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Tonight, we're diving into something that will fundamentally change how you see the night sky forever. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just another vampire tale. This is the Blood Moon Vampire Hunt, a practice so brutal and so methodical that it has kept entire bloodlines of the undead in check for centuries. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why even the most powerful vampires still flee when the moon turns red. But first, let me set the stage with something that happened just 3 centuries ago in the mountains of Transylvania. Something that was witnessed, documented, and sworn to by dozens of people who lived to tell the tale. The year was 1724. The place was a remote village called Brasov, nestled deep in the Carpathian Mountains. For months, the villagers had been living in terror. Cattle were found drained of blood, children were disappearing, and those who survived encounters with the darkness spoke of pale figures with burning eyes who moved faster than any mortal could follow. The local priest, Father Dmitri, had tried everything: holy water, blessed crosses, prayers that lasted until dawn. Nothing worked. The attacks continued. And with each passing night, the death toll climbed higher. But Father Dmitri knew something the others didn't. He had been raised by his grandmother, a woman who remembered the old ways, the methods that existed long before the church claimed dominion over the supernatural. She had told him about the Blood Moon Hunt, a ritual so ancient that it predated Christianity itself, yet so effective that even the church's most learned scholars whispered about it in the darkest corners of their libraries. And as fate would have it, the next blood moon was only days away. What happened over those 3 nights of the blood moon would become one of the most thoroughly documented vampire hunts in history. 17 witnesses survived to give testimony. 3 separate written accounts exist in church archives, and the physical evidence, the tools used, the methods employed, all of it was preserved and studied by scholars who spent their lives trying to understand how mortals could systematically hunt creatures that should have been impossible to kill. This wasn't a random encounter with the undead. This was warfare. Strategic, brutal, and devastatingly effective warfare that turned the natural world itself into a weapon against vampires. Because you see, the blood moon doesn't just look different. During a total lunar eclipse, when Earth's shadow turns the moon that deep, unsettling red, something fundamental changes in the supernatural balance of power. Vampires, for all their strength and speed and hypnotic abilities, have one critical weakness that most people don't understand. Their power is intimately connected to the phases of the moon. Just as werewolves are bound to lunar cycles, vampires draw their strength from the silver light of the full moon. But when that light is filtered through Earth's atmosphere, when it becomes red and dim and strange, their abilities begin to falter. Their supernatural speed slows to merely human levels. Their hypnotic gaze loses its power to entrance. Their ability to transform into mist or wolves or bats simply vanishes. For those precious hours when the moon bleeds red in the sky, vampires become vulnerable in ways they never are otherwise. And humanity, for centuries, has known exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. The Blood Moon vampire hunt isn't just about individual vampires. It's about entire covens, entire bloodlines of the undead that have grown too bold, too numerous, too dangerous for the surrounding human populations to survive. These hunts happen perhaps once or twice in a generation, when the lunar eclipse aligns with desperate necessity, and when someone still remembers the old knowledge. But here's what makes this tradition truly terrifying. The hunters don't wait for the blood moon to begin their work. The preparation starts months in advance, because hunting vampires during a lunar eclipse isn't just about having the right weapons or knowing their weaknesses. It's about understanding that you're dealing with creatures who have spent decades or centuries learning to survive, to adapt, to turn every advantage against their enemies. The hunters of Brasov began their preparation 6 months before the eclipse. They studied the feeding patterns of their local vampire coven, mapped their lairs, identified their escape routes, and most importantly, they began crafting the specialized tools that would be needed when the time came. Because killing a vampire, even a weakened vampire, requires more than just courage and holy water. The weapons used in a blood moon hunt are unlike anything you'll see in modern vampire fiction. Silver is important, yes, but it's not the silver bullets or silver stakes that movies love to show. The real weapons are far more sophisticated, far more cruel, and infinitely more effective. They're designed not just to kill vampires, but to ensure that the vampires can never return, never regenerate, never find a way back from whatever dark realm claims them after death. There's the sanctified iron, metal that has been blessed by 7 different priests and forged in fires that burned continuously for 13 days. Iron naturally repels supernatural creatures, but sanctified iron doesn't just repel vampires. It burns them on contact, sears their flesh like acid, and leaves wounds that heal slower than anything else in their immortal existence. Then there are the ashwood stakes, but not just any ashwood. The trees must be grown in consecrated ground, harvested during a new moon, and carved by hands that have never taken a human life. The stakes are then soaked in holy water, mixed with the blood of martyrs, creating weapons that can pierce vampire flesh as easily as a hot knife through butter. But perhaps the most terrifying weapon in the Blood Moon Hunter's arsenal is something called the binding chains. These are silver chains that have been inscribed with symbols from a dozen different religious traditions. Christian crosses, Jewish stars, Islamic crescents, Hindu Om symbols, Buddhist wheels, and others that predate all organized religion. The chains don't just hold vampires, they prevent them from accessing any supernatural abilities whatsoever, turning immortal predators into helpless prisoners. The hunters of Brasov spent weeks preparing these weapons, but the weapons were only part of the strategy, because the most important element of a blood moon hunt isn't the tools you use, it's the knowledge of exactly when and how to use them. Vampires aren't stupid. They've survived for centuries by being cunning, by being careful, by never underestimating their enemies. They know about blood moons just as well as the hunters do. They know their powers will be weakened. So, when a lunar eclipse approaches, Most vampires go into hiding. They retreat to their deepest lairs, surround themselves with their most loyal servants, and wait for the danger to pass. This is where the true genius of the blood moon hunt reveals itself. The hunters don't just wait for the eclipse to begin. They spend the weeks leading up to the blood moon, systematically eliminating every escape route, every safe haven, every bolt hole that the vampires might use. They turn the hunt into a siege, forcing their prey into increasingly desperate situations until the night of the eclipse, when the vampires have nowhere left to run. The psychological warfare is just as important as the physical preparation. Hunters will leave the bodies of lesser vampires in prominent locations where the more powerful ones will find them. They'll burn vampire safe houses during the day when the undead are sleeping. They'll turn vampire servants against their masters by offering protection or threatening families. By the time the blood moon rises, the vampires aren't just physically weakened. They're terrified, isolated, and running out of options. And that's exactly when the hunters strike. The night of the eclipse in Brasov began like any other. The villagers had been told to bar their doors, to keep their fires burning, and to pray until dawn. But hidden in the forests surrounding the village, 23 hunters waited in positions they had scouted and prepared for months. Each one carried weapons that had been blessed, consecrated, and designed specifically for what was to come. Father Dmitri led them, but he wasn't their commander. That role belonged to a woman known only as the widow Margareta, whose family had been hunting vampires for 7 generations. She knew things about the undead that weren't written in any book, secrets that had been passed down through bloodlines of hunters who had dedicated their lives to keeping humanity safe from the creatures of the night. As the moon began to darken, as Earth's shadow crept across its surface, the hunters felt it. A change in the air, a shift in the supernatural tension that always exists in places where vampires have fed. The undead were becoming vulnerable, and they knew it. The first phase of the hunt began not with violence, but with fire, specially prepared torches, their flames fed by oils that had been blessed, and herbs that vampires found repulsive, were lit simultaneously at 13 different points around the village. The smoke didn't just provide light. It carried scents that would drive vampires toward the hunters' prepared positions, funneling them into carefully laid traps. But the vampires of Brasov weren't going to go quietly into whatever fate awaited them. As their powers began to wane with the deepening eclipse, they made their own preparations. They gathered their remaining human servants, armed them with whatever weapons they could find, and prepared to fight, not just for their undead lives, but for their very existence. What followed was a battle that lasted the entire duration of the lunar eclipse, a clash between mortal hunters armed with faith and ancient knowledge, and immortal predators fighting with the desperation of creatures who knew they were facing their own extinction. The blood that was spilled that night didn't just stain the ground. According to the survivors, it seemed to glow in the red light of the eclipsed moon, as if the very earth was absorbing something more than just blood. The hunters had spent months preparing for this moment, but preparation can only take you so far when you're facing creatures that have spent centuries learning to kill. The vampires might have been weakened, but they were far from helpless. And as the battle raged through the night, it became clear that not everyone who entered the forest would live to see the dawn. But this is only the beginning of the story. What happened during those crucial hours when the moon bled red in the sky, the specific techniques the hunters used, the desperate countermeasures the vampires employed, and the horrifying discoveries that were made when the sun finally rose. All of that is still to come, because what the survivors discovered in those forest clearings wasn't just the aftermath of a supernatural battle. It was evidence of something far more disturbing, something that would change how they understood the very nature of vampires and their relationship with the blood moon itself. The widow Margareta had positioned her hunters in a formation that her grandmother called the 7 Stars of Solomon. Each group of 3 hunters occupied a specific point around the vampire territory, creating a pattern that supposedly channeled divine protection while preventing any escape routes. But as the eclipse deepened and the moon's light turned from silver to deep crimson, something unexpected began to happen. The vampires weren't just becoming weaker, they were changing. Their pale, aristocratic features began to shift, revealing something underneath that was far more primitive, far more monstrous than anyone had anticipated. Father Dimitri would later write in his journal that it was as if the red light of the eclipse was stripping away layers of illusion, showing the vampires as they truly were beneath centuries of learned sophistication. The first vampire to reveal itself came crashing through the undergrowth near the eastern position, where 3 hunters waited with their sanctified iron spears. But this wasn't the elegant, hypnotic nobleman that had been terrorizing their village for months. This was something that barely looked human at all. Its fingers had elongated into claws that could tear through bark and stone. Its face had distorted into a snarling mask of hunger and desperation. And its movements, while no longer supernaturally fast, carried the frenzied energy of a cornered predator. The hunters had trained for this moment, but training and reality are vastly different things. When the creature lunged at them, one of the men froze. The sanctified iron spear fell from his trembling hands as he stared into eyes that burned with a hunger that went beyond anything mortal. It was the widow Margareta herself who saved his life, appearing from the shadows to drive her ash wood stake deep into the vampire's chest. But here's what made that moment truly terrifying. The vampire didn't just die. As the blessed wood pierced its heart, its body began to dissolve, but not into dust as the old stories claimed. Instead, it melted into something that looked like black oil mixed with fresh blood, a substance that hissed and steamed when it touched the ground. And in that steaming puddle, shapes seemed to move, as if something was trying to reform itself from the viscous remains. The widow Margareta knew what to do. She pulled out a small clay vial filled with salt that had been blessed by 12 different faiths and scattered it over the remains. Only then did the writhing substance finally grow still. Only then was the vampire truly dead. This pattern repeated throughout the night as the hunters encountered vampire after vampire in their weakened state. Each death was different. Each required specific knowledge to ensure the creature couldn't return. Some had to be beheaded with sanctified iron blades. Others required the binding chains to hold them still, while blessed fire consumed their bodies. One particularly ancient vampire, a creature that had been terrorizing the region for over 2 centuries, had to be dismembered and each piece buried in separately consecrated ground. But the most disturbing discovery came when they found the vampire's main lair a series of caves that had been carved deep into the mountainside. The blood moon's red light seemed to penetrate even into those depths, revealing horrors that daylight had kept hidden. The walls were covered with symbols that predated any known writing system, carved not in stone, but in what appeared to be calcified human bone. In the deepest chamber, they found the feeding pools, circular depressions in the rock floor that had been filled with blood, but not just human blood. The hunters could identify the remains of animals, of other vampires, even of creatures they couldn't identify at all. The pools seemed to serve some ritual purpose, as if the vampires had been trying to use the collected blood to strengthen themselves, or perhaps to communicate with something even darker. Father Dimitri made detailed sketches of everything they found, but when he tried to copy the strange symbols on the walls, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. The widow Margareta warned him to stop, explaining that some knowledge was too dangerous for mortal minds to contain. Instead, they did what hunters had done for generations. They destroyed everything. The caves were sealed with blessed concrete mixed with iron filings and salt. The feeding pools were filled with holy water and consecrated earth, and the entrance was marked with warning symbols that would tell any future hunter exactly what lay beneath, while ensuring that no one else would ever be tempted to explore those depths. But even as they worked to contain the horror they had uncovered, the blood moon hunt wasn't over. The eclipse was reaching its peak, and the most powerful vampires, the ones who had survived by being more cunning and more dangerous than their lesser kindred, were still out there, and they were getting desperate. The attack came just as the moon reached its deepest red, when the eclipse was at its most total, and the vampires at their most vulnerable. But vulnerability and helplessness are not the same thing, as the hunters were about to learn in the most violent way possible. 3 ancient vampires, creatures that had ruled the region's undead for longer than anyone could remember, emerged from hiding simultaneously. They had coordinated their attack, using their remaining human servants as distractions while they targeted the hunters' leadership. Their goal wasn't to win the battle. It was to survive long enough for the eclipse to end and their full power to return. The widow Margareta found herself facing the eldest of the 3, a vampire who called himself Baron Valeriu and claimed to have walked the earth since the time of the Roman Empire. Even weakened by the blood moon, he was still faster and stronger than any human had a right to be. His claws could tear through leather armor like paper, and his bite could drain a man's life in seconds. But Margareta had something he didn't expect. She had been born during a previous blood moon, and her grandmother had taught her that such children carried a natural resistance to vampire powers. As Valerio lunged at her, confident in his ability to mesmerize her with his gaze, he found himself staring into eyes that showed no fear, no submission, only cold determination. The battle between them lasted nearly an hour, a deadly dance through the forest as Margareta used every trick her family had taught her. She led him through areas where she had prepared traps, used the terrain to her advantage, and slowly weakened him with small wounds from her blessed weapons. But it was when she finally cornered him against a cliff face, with nowhere left to run, that the true horror of the blood moon hunt revealed itself. As the vampire realized he was about to die, something changed in his expression. The aristocratic mask fell away completely, revealing not just the monster beneath, but something that looked almost human, almost vulnerable. For just a moment, Margareta saw not an undead predator, but a man who had been cursed with an existence he never chose, who had spent centuries trying to maintain some semblance of the person he once was. But that moment of sympathy nearly cost her everything. Valeria's apparent vulnerability was his final trick, a last desperate attempt to make her hesitate. As she paused, stake raised above his heart, he struck with the last of his strength. His claws raked across her throat, drawing blood and injecting something that burned like liquid fire. Margareta knew she had been poisoned with vampire venom, a substance that would slowly transform her into one of the creatures she had spent her life hunting. She had perhaps minutes before the change became irreversible. With her last act as a fully human being, she drove the ashwood stake deep into Valerius' chest and watched as his ancient body finally crumbled into that same black, oily substance that had marked the death of every vampire that night. But her sacrifice revealed something that would haunt the surviving hunters for the rest of their lives. As Valerio died, as his essence dissolved into the cursed oil, something else emerged from his remains, a pale, translucent form that looked like the man he had been before his transformation centuries ago. And that ghostly figure didn't look evil or monstrous. It looked grateful. It looked free. The other hunters found Margareta as the eclipse began to wane. As the moon's light slowly returned to its normal silver glow, the vampire venom was already coursing through her veins, beginning the transformation that would turn her into the very thing she had dedicated her life to destroying. She had perhaps an hour before the change became complete. Father Dimitri wanted to try to save her, to find some way to reverse the vampire's curse. But Margareta knew better. She had seen what happened to people who were partially transformed during blood moon hunts. They became something worse than vampires, creatures caught between human and undead, driven mad by their inability to exist fully in either world. Instead, she made a request that would become part of blood moon hunting tradition for generations to come. She asked to be granted a hunter's death, to die as a human rather than live as a monster, and she asked that her knowledge, all the secrets her family had guarded for 7 generations, be passed on to someone who could continue the work. That someone was Father Dimitri's young nephew, a boy named Alexandru, who had shown an unusual ability to sense supernatural presences. As Margareta lay dying from the blessed silver blade that had pierced her heart, she whispered to him the locations of hidden weapons caches, the names of vampire bloodlines that still threatened the region, and most importantly, the dates of future blood moon eclipses when the hunts could be renewed. But she also told him something that would change how he understood the entire purpose of the blood moon hunt. The vampires they had killed that night, the creatures they had fought so desperately to destroy, had once been human. They had been transformed against their will, cursed with an existence that trapped them between life and death. The blood moon hunt wasn't just about protecting humanity from monsters. It was about freeing those monsters from a curse they never chose to bear. As dawn broke over the Carpathian Mountains, as the last traces of the blood moon faded from the sky, the surviving hunters counted their losses. 7 of the original 23 had died in the battle. 3 others, including Margareta, had been infected with vampire venom and granted hunters deaths before they could transform. But they had accomplished something that hadn't been done in over a century. They had completely eliminated a vampire coven, broken a bloodline that had terrorized the region for generations. The physical evidence of their success was undeniable. 13 vampire corpses had been properly destroyed according to the ancient protocols. The feeding pools had been cleansed and sealed. The symbols in the caves had been covered with blessed concrete. And most importantly, the attacks on the village stopped completely. But the psychological impact on the survivors was something none of them had anticipated. They had seen the faces of the vampires as they died, had witnessed the ghostly figures that emerged from their dissolving remains. They had been forced to confront the possibility that the monsters they hunted had once been innocent people, victims of a curse that turned them into predators against their will. This realization would fundamentally change how future blood moon hunts were conducted. The focus shifted from simple extermination to something more complex, more morally ambiguous. Hunters began to seek ways to break vampire curses rather than just destroy the cursed. They developed techniques for determining which vampires could be saved and which had fallen too far into darkness to be redeemed. The blood moon hunt tradition didn't end with the dawn in Brasov. If anything, that night marked the beginning of something far more organized, far more systematic than anything that had come before. Because what Alexandru discovered in the months following that eclipse would reveal that vampires weren't just random monsters scattered across the countryside. They were part of something much larger, much more coordinated, and infinitely more dangerous. The first clue came when Alexandru was cataloging the belongings they had recovered from the vampire lair. Among the ancient artifacts and cursed relics, he found something that shouldn't have existed, a series of letters written in multiple languages, all bearing the same crimson wax seal. The letters weren't just correspondence between individual vampires. They were tactical reports, strategic assessments, and most disturbing of all, detailed maps showing the locations of other vampire covens across Europe. These weren't isolated predators hunting alone. They were part of a network, a shadow organization that spanned continents and had been operating for centuries. The vampires of Brasov had been receiving orders from somewhere else, following a larger plan that involved the systematic cultivation of human populations like livestock. But here's what made Alexandru's blood run cold. The letters were dated not just from recent years, but from decades past. Some bore dates that went back over 2 centuries. This vampire network had been planning something for generations, slowly building towards some ultimate goal that the Blood Moon Hunt had only temporarily disrupted. The maps were the most revealing. They showed not just vampire territories, but human settlements that had been marked with different symbols. Some villages were marked with red symbols, indicating active feeding grounds. Others bore black marks, suggesting they had been completely drained and abandoned. But most disturbing were the settlements marked in gold, villages that appeared to be under some form of vampire protection. Alexandru spent weeks deciphering the meaning of these golden marks before the horrible truth became clear. These weren't just feeding grounds or territories. They were breeding programs. The vampires had been selectively managing certain human populations, ensuring the survival of bloodlines with specific traits that made them more suitable for transformation. The blood moon hunt tradition had stumbled onto something that was far more than just local monster hunting. They had discovered evidence of what could only be described as vampire agriculture, a systematic approach to human cultivation that had been operating in secret for centuries. This revelation transformed how the remaining hunters viewed their mission. They weren't just protecting individual villages from supernatural predators. They were fighting a war against an enemy that had been planning their moves for longer than any human institution had existed. And they were losing badly. Alexandru knew that the traditional approach of waiting for blood moons and conducting isolated hunts would never be enough to combat this level of organization. The vampire network could afford to lose individual covens, individual bloodlines, because they had dozens of others operating simultaneously across the continent. For every vampire killed during a blood moon hunt, 3 others were being created in territories where humans had no idea they were under supernatural surveillance. But the blood moon still held the key to victory, because Alexandru had discovered something in Margareta's final notes that she hadn't had time to explain before her death. The red light of the lunar eclipse didn't just weaken individual vampires, it disrupted their ability to communicate with each other across vast distances. During normal nights, vampires could share thoughts and coordinate actions across hundreds of miles through what Margareta had called the blood bond, a psychic connection that linked all vampires within the same bloodline. But during a total lunar eclipse, when the moon's light was filtered through Earth's atmosphere and turned red, this network of supernatural communication collapsed completely. This meant that a properly coordinated series of blood moon hunts, conducted simultaneously across multiple regions, could potentially cripple the vampire network's ability to respond and adapt. Instead of isolated village-level hunts, Alexandru began to envision something unprecedented, a continental campaign that would strike at vampire covens across Europe during the same eclipse, preventing them from warning each other or coordinating their defenses. The logistics of such an undertaking were staggering. It would require hunters who knew the ancient techniques, weapons that had been properly consecrated, and most importantly, precise intelligence about vampire locations and capabilities. But Alexandru had something that previous generations of hunters had never possessed. He had the captured correspondence from the Brasov Coven, complete with detailed maps and tactical assessments of vampire strength across the continent. Over the next 3 years, Alexandru quietly began reaching out to other hunter families, other bloodlines that had maintained the old knowledge. He traveled across Eastern Europe, seeking out the scattered descendants of those who had participated in blood moon hunts centuries past. What he found was both encouraging and terrifying. The encouraging news was that the hunter bloodlines still existed. In remote villages and isolated mountain communities, families still remembered the techniques their ancestors had used to combat vampires. They still maintained weapons caches filled with sanctified iron and blessed ash wood stakes. They still knew the ritual preparations necessary for a successful hunt. The terrifying news was that every single hunter family he contacted reported the same thing. Vampire activity in their regions had increased dramatically over the past several decades. The isolated predators of previous centuries had been replaced by organized groups that operated with military precision. Villages that had been safe for generations were suddenly experiencing mysterious disappearances, and unexplained deaths. But perhaps most disturbing was the pattern Alexandru began to notice in these reports. The increased vampire activity wasn't random. It was following a specific timeline, building towards something that would reach its peak during the next major lunar eclipse sequence. The vampires weren't just expanding their operations. They were preparing for something that would require massive amounts of human blood and supernatural energy. Alexandru's investigation led him to a monastery in the mountains of Romania, where the monks had been maintaining records of supernatural activity for over 8 centuries. What he found in their archives would change everything he thought he knew about the relationship between vampires and lunar eclipses. The monks had been tracking a pattern that repeated every few centuries, a cycle of vampire activity that aligned with rare astronomical events. According to their calculations, the vampire network wasn't just responding to individual blood moons. They were working toward a convergence that occurred only once every 400 years, when multiple lunar eclipses would occur in rapid succession across a period of several months. During these convergence periods, the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of the dead would weaken dramatically. The vampires weren't just trying to expand their feeding territories or increase their numbers. They were attempting to use the accumulated blood and life force they had harvested to tear open a permanent gateway between dimensions, allowing something far worse than vampires to enter the mortal world. The next convergence was less than 2 years away. The vampire network had been preparing for this moment for centuries, carefully positioning their covens and accumulating the resources they would need for their ultimate ritual. If Alexandru and his fellow hunters couldn't stop them, the blood moon hunts of the past would seem like minor skirmishes compared to the supernatural war that was about to engulf the world. But stopping a centuries-old conspiracy would require more than traditional hunting techniques. It would require Alexandru to delve deeper into the forbidden knowledge that previous generations of hunters had carefully avoided. He would need to understand not just how to kill vampires, but how to manipulate the same supernatural forces that the vampires themselves used. This meant learning to read the ancient symbols that covered vampire lairs, symbols that could drive mortal minds to madness if studied too intensely. It meant experimenting with blood magic rituals that blurred the line between hunter and monster, and most dangerously, it meant attempting to communicate with the ghostly essences that emerged when vampires died, trying to gather intelligence from the very creatures he had spent his life destroying. The monastery's archives contained texts that described these forbidden techniques, knowledge that had been gathered by hunter scholars over the centuries, but deemed too dangerous for general use. The monks warned Alexandru that pursuing this path would change him in ways he might not be able to control. The line between hunting monsters and becoming one was thinner than most people realized. But Alexandru had seen the maps, had read the correspondence, had calculated what would happen if the vampire convergence ritual succeeded. The choice wasn't between remaining human or becoming something else. The choice was between fighting with every weapon available, regardless of the personal cost, or watching the world fall to creatures that had been planning humanity's downfall for longer than recorded history. As he began his descent into the darkest corners of supernatural knowledge, Alexandru couldn't shake the memory of Margaretta's final words. Her revelation that vampires had once been human victims of a curse they never chose. If that was true, then the ghostly figures that emerged from their deaths weren't just the spirits of monsters. They were the souls of people who had been trapped for centuries in bodies that forced them to commit atrocities against their will. This realization would fundamentally alter Alexandru's approach to the coming war. He wasn't just fighting to protect humanity from vampires. He was fighting to free the human souls trapped within vampire bodies, to break a curse that had been perpetuated for millennia through violence and desperation. The Blood Moon Hunt was about to evolve into something that transcended simple monster hunting. It was becoming a crusade for redemption, a battle not just for the future of the living world, but for the salvation of the damned. And the weapons Alexandru would need for such a war would have to be forged from something far more powerful than sanctified iron or blessed ash wood. They would have to be forged from hope itself, from the belief that even the most monstrous curse could be broken if enough people were willing to sacrifice everything to break it. The blood moon was coming, and with it, the final test of whether humanity's capacity for compassion was stronger than centuries of accumulated darkness. But first, Alexandru would have to survive his journey into the forbidden knowledge and emerge with his humanity intact, because the greatest danger in fighting monsters has always been the risk of becoming one yourself. And the techniques he was about to learn had driven previous hunters to madness, to suicide, and to transformation into the very creatures they had once hunted. The monastery's deepest vaults contained more than just books and scrolls. They held the preserved remains of hunters who had delved too deeply into vampire magic, their bodies mummified but their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. These were the cautionary tales, the warnings of what happened when mortals tried to wield supernatural power without proper preparation. Yet Alexandru knew he had no choice but to risk joining them. The alternative was the end of everything human civilization had built, the transformation of the entire world into a feeding ground for creatures that existed beyond death itself. The Blood Moon Hunt had always been about impossible choices, about people willing to sacrifice themselves to protect others. Now it was about to become something even more demanding. It was about to become a test of whether love could triumph over an eternity of hate. As Alexandru descended deeper into the monastery's forbidden archives, the weight of centuries pressed down upon him like a physical force. The air grew thick with the scent of ancient parchment and something else, something that reminded him of the black oil that had pooled beneath dying vampires. The monks had warned him that knowledge itself could be cursed, that some truths were too dangerous for mortal minds to contain. But time was running short. The astronomical calculations were precise and unforgiving. In 18 months, the convergence would begin. 4 lunar eclipses in rapid succession, each one weakening the barriers between worlds, each one bringing the vampire network closer to their ultimate goal. Alexandru had to master techniques that had taken previous hunters decades to learn, and he had to do it without losing his sanity in the process. The first forbidden text he encountered was bound in what appeared to be human skin, its pages written in a mixture of Latin and symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. The title, as far as he could translate it, was The Communion of Shadows, and it described techniques for communicating with the spirits that emerged from vampire deaths. According to the text, these ghostly essences retained memories from their mortal lives, including knowledge of vampire weaknesses and hiding places that even centuries of undeath couldn't erase. But speaking with them required the hunter to partially open their own soul to the realm of the dead, a process that left permanent marks on both body and mind. Alexandru's first attempt nearly killed him. Following the ritual instructions precisely, he used his own blood to draw protective circles around a vial of the black oil he had collected from Brasov. As he spoke the incantations written in the ancient text, the oil began to bubble and steam, releasing vapors that formed into a barely visible human shape. The spirit that emerged was Baron Valeriu himself, or rather, the human soul that had been trapped within the vampire's cursed body for over a millennium. But this ghostly figure bore little resemblance to the aristocratic predator Alexandru had helped destroy. Instead, he saw a young Roman soldier, barely 20 years old, whose face was etched with centuries of anguish and guilt. "I never wanted to kill them," the spirit whispered, its voice like wind through autumn leaves. "Every night for 800 years, I fought against the hunger, tried to resist the compulsion, but the curse was stronger than my will. I watched my own hands tear out throats, felt my own teeth pierce innocent flesh, all while screaming inside a body that was no longer mine to control." The revelation hit Alexandru like a physical blow. Every vampire they had destroyed during the Blood Moon hunt had been a victim as much as a monster. The creatures they fought weren't evil by choice, but prisoners of a supernatural curse that turned their own bodies into weapons against their will. But the spirit had more to reveal. The vampire network wasn't just a collection of individual predators. It was a hive mind of sorts, with the oldest and most powerful vampires serving as nodes in a vast supernatural communications system. When one vampire died, its accumulated knowledge and memories were absorbed by the network, making the remaining creatures stronger and more cunning. The convergence ritual, Valerius' spirit continued. It's not just about opening a gateway. It's about merging all vampire consciousness into a single entity, a god of hunger that will consume every living thing on earth. They've been gathering power for this moment for over 2,000 years, since the fall of Rome itself. The implications were staggering. The Blood Moon hunts hadn't just been protecting individual villages from local threats. They had been fighting a war against something that was preparing to devour all of human civilization. And every vampire they killed, every spirit they freed, weakened the network's collective power just a little bit more. But Alexandru also learned something that filled him with both hope and terror. The convergence ritual had a weakness, a single point of failure that could collapse the entire network if properly exploited. The vampire god they were trying to create required a physical anchor in the mortal world, a vessel of sufficient power to contain the merged consciousness of thousands of undead minds. That vessel was being prepared in a hidden fortress deep in the Carpathian Mountains, a place that had been consecrated to darkness centuries before Christianity ever reached the region. The fortress was guarded by the oldest and most powerful vampires in existence, creatures so ancient that they had forgotten their own mortal names. But during the convergence, when all their power was focused on the ritual, they would be vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Alexandru spent months learning to communicate with other vampire spirits, gathering intelligence about the network's structure and capabilities. Each conversation left him weaker, more hollow, as if pieces of his own soul were being traded away for the knowledge he desperately needed. The monks warned him that he was approaching the breaking point, the moment when his humanity would be so damaged that he would become something else entirely. But he pressed on, driven by the faces of everyone he had failed to save. Everyone who would die if the convergence succeeded. He learned the locations of dozens of vampire strongholds across Europe. He discovered the identities of human collaborators who had been serving the network for generations. Most importantly, he uncovered the exact timing and ritual components that would be needed for the convergence ceremony. The vampire network had been planning to use the blood of 1,000 innocents for their ritual, but Alexandru's investigation revealed something they hadn't anticipated. The ritual could be reversed, turned against itself, if the right sacrifices were made at the right moment. Instead of creating a vampire god, the convergence could be used to break every vampire curse simultaneously, freeing thousands of trapped souls and destroying the network forever. But the cost would be enormous. The reversal ritual would require hunters to voluntarily enter the realm of the dead, to merge their own life force with the collective vampire consciousness. At the moment of convergence, they would have to become what they fought against, accepting transformation into vampires themselves, in order to poison the network from within. It was a suicide mission disguised as salvation. The hunters who undertook it would save the world, but they would not live to see the dawn of the world they had saved. They would die as monsters, trusting that their sacrifice would break the curse not just for themselves, but for every vampire that had ever existed. Alexandru knew he couldn't ask others to make such a sacrifice. But he also knew he couldn't face the vampire network alone. He needed hunters who understood the true nature of what they were fighting. People who had seen the ghostly faces of the spirits they had freed and understood that vampires were victims as much as they were monsters. Over the following months, Alexandru traveled across Europe one final time, not to recruit an army, but to find individuals who shared his vision of redemption rather than simple destruction. He found them in the most unlikely places. A former priest who had lost his faith after killing a vampire child. A widow whose husband had been transformed against his will and begged her to end his cursed existence. A scholar who had spent decades trying to find a cure for vampirism, rather than just better ways to kill vampires. One by one, he shared with them what he had learned, showed them the evidence of the coming convergence, and explained the terrible choice that lay before them. Some walked away, unable to accept the moral complexity of fighting monsters by becoming monsters. Others stayed, drawn by the possibility of breaking a curse that had caused suffering for millennia. By the time the convergence began, Alexandru had assembled a group of 13 hunters, each one prepared to sacrifice their humanity to save the world. They called themselves the Last Hunt, not because they would be the final vampire hunters in history, but because they would be the last to face the choice between remaining human and saving everyone they loved. The fortress in the Carpathians was everything the vampire spirits had described and worse. Built into the living rock of the mountain itself, it had been carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Passages that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, and chambers that existed in more dimensions than human perception could process. The vampire network had been preparing this place for centuries, turning it into a nexus where the barriers between worlds were already paper-thin. As the first lunar eclipse of the convergence sequence began, Alexandru and his hunters took their positions around the fortress. They had spent months studying the ritual they would need to perform, practicing the incantations that would allow them to merge with the vampire network at the crucial moment. Each of them carried weapons forged not just to kill vampires, but to channel their own life force into the curse-breaking ritual. The battle that followed was unlike any blood moon hunt in history. The hunters weren't trying to destroy the vampires they encountered. Instead, they were fighting their way deeper into the fortress, toward the central chamber where the convergence ritual was taking place. Every vampire they killed added its power to the network they were trying to infiltrate. Every step forward brought them closer to their own transformation. Alexandru felt the change beginning as they reached the fortress's heart. His human blood was cooling, his heartbeat slowing, his vision sharpening in ways that revealed the supernatural energy flowing through the ancient stones. The curse was taking hold, turning him into the very thing he had spent his life fighting. But this time, the transformation was voluntary, guided, weaponized. In the central chamber, they found the vampire god in the process of being born. Thousands of ghostly figures swirled around a massive stone altar, the accumulated consciousness of every vampire that had ever existed, slowly merging into a single, terrible entity. The oldest vampires stood in a circle around the altar, their bodies serving as conduits for power that had been building for centuries. This was the moment Alexandru and his hunters had prepared for. As one, they plunged their blessed weapons not into vampire flesh, but into their own hearts, releasing their life force at the exact instant when the convergence reached its peak. Their human souls, willingly transformed by vampire curse, but still retaining their essential humanity, entered the network like a virus designed to destroy it from within. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The merging vampire consciousness, designed to absorb and integrate the memories and power of the undead, suddenly found itself contaminated with something it couldn't process. The willing sacrifice of mortal souls who chose damnation to save others. The network began to collapse, unraveling centuries of accumulated power in a matter of seconds. Every vampire in the fortress began to scream as the curse that bound them shattered. But these weren't screams of pain or rage. They were screams of relief, of gratitude, of souls finally being released from prisons they had occupied for centuries. The ghostly figures swirling around the altar began to disperse, each one pausing to look at Alexandru and his hunters with expressions of profound thanks before fading into whatever realm awaited the truly dead. As dawn broke over the Carpathian Mountains, the fortress began to crumble. The supernatural energies that had held it together for centuries were dissipating, leaving behind only ordinary stone and mortar that couldn't support the impossible architecture. Alexandru felt his own body beginning to dissolve as the vampire curse that had transformed him completed its work. But instead of becoming the black oil he had seen before, he felt himself becoming something else entirely. He was becoming light itself, joining the spirits he had helped to free in whatever realm lay beyond the mortal world. As his consciousness faded, he heard the voices of every vampire spirit he had ever spoken with, thanking him not for destroying them, but for finally allowing them to rest. The last hunt had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. Across Europe, across the world, vampires were experiencing the same liberation. Centuries-old curses were breaking, trapped souls were being freed, and the network that had threatened to devour human civilization was collapsing into nothing. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about that dawn was not the destruction of the vampire network, but what happened to the knowledge Alexandru and his hunters had gathered, the techniques for communicating with spirits, the methods for breaking supernatural curses, the understanding that monsters were often victims themselves. All of it survived in the monastery archives. Future generations would find these records and learn from them. They would understand that the true horror of the Blood Moon vampire hunt was never the monsters they fought, but the realization that those monsters had once been human. They would know that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from destroying your enemies, but from saving them from themselves. The Blood Moon still rises, crimson and terrible, casting its light across a world that no longer fears the creatures of the night. But those who know the true history of the hunt understand that the red light serves as a reminder of something far more important than supernatural warfare. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when faced with enemies that seem irredeemably evil, there is always a choice between hatred and compassion, between destruction and redemption. The Blood Moon vampire hunt succeeded not because the hunters were stronger than their enemies, but because they chose to see the humanity hidden within the monsters they fought. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. In a world filled with darkness, the greatest weapon against evil is not violence, but the refusal to let that darkness transform us into the very thing we fight against. The hunters of the Blood Moon understood this truth, and their sacrifice ensured that future generations would have the chance to learn it as well. The hunt is over, the monsters are free, and the moon, when it turns red in the sky, no longer signals the beginning of a battle, but the anniversary of the greatest act of compassion in human history.